Hi everyone, today we're going to be going over Chapter 14, Part 2, and we're focusing on the Industrial Revolution. The British inventors in 1750 perfected a series of machines for mass production of textiles. This harnessed the steam to usher in a modern factory system of the Industrial Revolution. The spectacular transformation was also occurring in agricultural production as well as other methods of transportation and communication. The factory system slowly spread from Britain, which was the world's workshop. Why was America slow to industrialize? Land was cheap, labor was scarce, and money for capital investment was also scarce. Samuel Slater is called the father of the factory system. He memorized plans for the machinery in Britain and then escaped to America and built his factories here. He won the backing of capitalist Moses Brown and reconstructed essential apparatuses in 1791. This put together the first efficient machinery for spinning cotton thread in America. The problem was accessing the cotton fiber, and Eli Whitney's cotton gin will solve that problem. The momentous effects of the cotton gin is that the planters cleared more and more land for cotton, and the cotton kingdom pushed westward. Eli Whitney, when he created the cotton gin, did not think that this was going to expand slavery. He thought that it would really put an end to it and limit it, but that's not actually what happened. There was an insatiable demand for cotton, which riveted the chains of slavery more tightly, which he did not expect. And Yankee machines put out avalanches of textiles as a result. So America's Industrial Revolution first blossomed in cotton textiles. This is a picture of the cotton gin. The factories first flourished in New England, then branched out to New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania. In the South, they were increasingly wedded to grow cotton. There was very little manufacturing. The capital that existed was invested in slaves, and local consumers, for the most part, were desperately poor. New England was an industrial center, because the stony soil made farming difficult and manufacturing very attractive. There was a dense population which provided necessary labor and markets. Seaports provided easy import of raw materials and export of finished products. Rivers provided an abundant water power. So by 1860, greater than 4 million pounds of southern cotton poured into the mills, mostly in New England. This is a picture of Francis Cabot Lowell's mill in Waltham, Massachusetts. This is also a picture of the inside, where they would basically take the cotton and spin it into textile thread. As the factory system flourished, it embraced other industries. The contribution of Whitney's interchangeable parts was applied to the manufacture of firearms. The basis of mass production was basically to use an assembly line method. It gave the North the factories that ensured military preponderance over the South. Ironically, Eli Whitney, by perfecting the cotton gin, gave slavery a renewed lease on life. The sewing machine was invented first by Elias Howe in 1846 and then perfected by Isaac Singer. You can see Howe's invention here and then Singer's tweaking of his invention here. Basically, it gave a strong boost to northern industrialization and became the foundation for ready-made clothing. It moved sewing from private homes to the factory. Each new invention stimulated still more imaginative inventions. In the decade ending 1800, only 306 patents were registered, but by the end of 1860, there were 28,000. There were key changes in form and legal status of business organizations. The principle of limited liability aided the concentration of capital. Boston Associates was created by 15 Boston families, and basically the laws of free incorporation meant that businesses could create corporations without applying for individual charters from the legislatures. Samuel Morse invented the telegraph. He secured $30,000 from Congress to experiment with these talking wires. In 1844, he strung a wire 40 miles from Washington to Baltimore and tapped out the historic message, "What hath God wrought?" This is the telegraph and Morse's code. By the time of London's World Fair in 1851, American products were prominent among the world's commercial wonders. Fairgoers crowded into the Crystal Palace to see McCormick's Reaper, Morse's Telegraph, Colt's firearms, and Charles Goodyear's vulcanized rubber goods. The factory system had created an acute labor problem. Manufacturing had been done in the home before this, and master craftsmen and apprentices had worked together. The Industrial Revolution submerged personal association into impersonal ownership in factories, in spindle cities, surrounded by hovels or small houses of wage slaves. This is a picture of an operator working on a jigging machine for Samuel Coates' state-of-the-art gun factory in Hartford, Connecticut. This is a craftsman's shop, basically, that's showing small scale and intimacy in producing handmade wheels for carts and carriages. So they basically, two pictures, if you were looking at a prompt of them, would show you the difference in what was becoming the factory system and what it was like to work there, as opposed to a small, homemade, or more skill-based or craft-based job. Workers' conditions had very long hours and very low wages. Their meals were skimpy, and workers toiled in unsanitary buildings which were poorly ventilated, lighted, or heated. They were forbidden to form unions to raise wages, and there were only 24 recorded strikes before 1835. Child labor was also exploited. In 1820, many of the nation's industrial toilers were children under 10. They were victims of factory. The children were mentally blighted, emotionally starved, physically stunted, and brutally whipped in special whipping rooms. In Slater's mill of 1791, the first machine tenders were 7 boys and 2 girls, all under the age of 12. Lots of adult wage workers in the 1820s to 1830s in many states. Many states granted the laboring man the right to vote. They strove to lighten the burden through workingmen's parties. Many workers gave loyalty to the Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson. And besides the 10-hour day, there were higher wages and tolerable working conditions, and the workers demanded public education and an end to imprisonment for debt. Employers fought the 10-hour day. They argued that reduced hours would lessen production, increase costs, and demoralize the workers. Laborers would have so much leisure time that the devil would lead them to mischief. In 1840, President Van Buren established a 10-hour day for federal employees on public works. In later years, many states began reducing hours of the working people. Day laborers tried to improve their lot. Their strongest weapon was strikes. Dozens of strikes erupted in the 1830s and 1840s. They sought higher wages, 10-hour days, and the goals such as the right to smoke on the job. Workers lost more strikes than they won, and employers imported strike breakers to break the strike. The labor raised its voice against the immigrants. The labor basically made an effort to organize. Some 300,000 trade unionists tried to organize by 1830. This declined as a result of the severe depression in the 1837, but won a promising legal victory in 1842 in the Commonwealth versus Hunt, where the Massachusetts Supreme Court ruled that unions were not legal conspiracies, but they provided methods that were honorable and peaceful to make things better for the worker. The case did not legalize the right to strike. This is a picture of Eli's house sewing machine in 1846. Women became part of factory production and the economy during this time period. Factories undermined the work of women in homes, and factories also offered work to those that were displaced. That's supposed to say. Factory jobs promised greater economic independence for women and the means to buy manufactured products from the new market economy. Factory girls toiled 6 days a week, 12 to 13 hours a day from dark to dark. So in a textile mill in Lowell, Massachusetts, workers mostly were New England farm girls. They were supervised on and off the job by watchful matrons. They were escorted to church and from company boarding houses, they were forbidden to form unions, and there were very few outlets to protest the grueling working conditions. This is a picture of the sewing floor of Thompson's skirt factory in 1859. Factory jobs were still unusual for women. There were few opportunities to be economically self-supporting. Mainly nursing, domestic services, and teaching could provide that. The teaching profession became feminized as men left for other opportunities. Other opportunities in household service could include one white family in 10 employing poor white immigrant or black women. 10% of white women were working outside the home. 20% of all women were employed at some time before marriage. The vast majority of working women were single, and upon marriage, they left their job to become wives and mothers without wages. The cult of domesticity was a widespread cultural creed that glorified the customary functions of the homemaker. Married women commanded moral power and increasingly made decisions that altered the character of the family itself. This is very similar to the whole idea of Republican motherhood that occurred following the American Revolution. Women's roles were changing. The Industrial Revolution changed the life in home of 19th century traditional women's sphere. Love, not parental arrangement, started to determine the choice of spouse, yet parents retained the power of veto. Families became more closely knit and affectionate. They provided emotional refuge against threatening impersonality of big cities and industrialism. Families also grew smaller. The fertility rate dropped for women between the ages of 14 and 45, and birth control was still taboo, but women played a large part in having fewer children. The newly assertive role has been called domestic feminism. Smaller families meant child-centered families. What Europeans saw in American families as permissiveness was a consequence of the new idea of child rearing. The child's will was not simply broken, but rather to be shaped. Good citizens were raised not only to be meekly obedient, but to be independent individuals, making decisions on internalized morals. Emerging outlines of a modern family were created. They were small, affectionate, and child-centered. They provided a special area for talents of women and was a big improvement from earlier conditions of grinding toil, often alongside of men in the fields. This is a picture of a York, Pennsylvania family with their servant, which portrays an idealized picture of the home as the women's sphere. Flourishing farms changed the face of the West. The Trans-Allegheny region, especially Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, became the nation's breadbasket, and before long would become the granary to the world. The pioneer families hacked clearing out forests, they planted cornfields, and yellow grain also was amazingly versatile. Most Western products were first moved by the Ohio-Mississippi rivers. Inventions helped farmers be more productive. John Deere, in 1837, produced a steel plow that broke the stubborn soil, but was light enough to be pulled by horses rather than oxen. In 1830, Cyrus McCormick invented the mechanical mower reaper, which could do the work of 5 men with sickles and scythes, and to Western farmers, this was what the cotton gin was to the South in terms of allowing them to produce more. This is a picture of McCormick's miraculous reaper. The McCormick reaper made ambitious capitalists out of humble plowsmen. Subsistence farming gave way to large-scale food production. Specialized cash crop agriculture came to dominate the Trans-Allegheny West. With it followed mounting indebtedness. Farmers wanted more land and more machinery, and dreamed of new markets in the mushrooming factory towns of the East or across the Atlantic. However, they were still landlocked and needed a transportation revolution. McCormick's reaper, again, this is mass production within the simple workplace. In 1789, when the Constitution launched, primitive methods of travel were still dominant. Waterborne travel was very slow, uncertain, and dangerous. Stagecoaches and wagons lurched over bone-shaking roads. Cheap, efficient transportation increasingly was needed. So in the 1790s, a private company completed the profitable Lancaster Turnpike in Pennsylvania, running 62 miles from Philadelphia to Lancaster. As the driver approached the toll gate on the turnpike, they were confronted by a barrier of sharp pikes, which were turned aside when the toll was paid, which is why it's called a turnpike. Western road building, always expensive, encountered many obstacles. Noisy states' writers opposed federal aid to local projects. Eastern states protested against being bled of populations by westward-reaching arteries. And Westerners scored a key triumph in 1811 when the federal government started construction of the National Road, which is known as the Cumberland Road. Robert Fulton also started the steamboat craze. He installed powerful steam engines on the Clermont, and in 1807 it went from New York City up the Hudson River to Albany, 150 miles in the span of 32 hours. The success of the steamboat was sensational. Fulton changed all of America's navigable streams into two-way arteries, doubling the carrying capacity. So now, where you could not go against the current in the past, now steamboats could do that. In 1820, you had 60 steamboats on the Mississippi and its tributaries. By 1860, you have over 1,000. This is a picture of the Mississippi River in times of peace, and it shows the steamboats coming up and down the Mississippi. In April 1865, the steamer Sultana exploded, killing 1,700 passengers. So steamboats were also dangerous, but they played a vital role in opening the West and South. Clinton's Big Ditch in New York City was the talk of everyone. The canal cutting craze paralleled the boom in turnpikes and steamboats. New Yorkers, who were denied federal aid by the state's writers, funded the Erie Canal themselves to link the Great Lakes with the Hudson River. The driving leadership behind it was Governor DeWitt Clinton. The project was called Clinton's Big Ditch, or the Governor's Gutter, and people initially didn't take him seriously. This is a map of the major rivers, roads, and canals from 1825 to 1860. The Erie Canal was begun in 1817, and the canal stretched 363 miles from Buffalo on Lake Erie to the Hudson River onto New York Harbor. Shipping sped up as cost and time dropped significantly. Other economic ripples occurred. The value of the land along the route skyrocketed, and new cities such as Rochester and Syracuse blossomed as a result. The new profitability of farming in the Old Northwest, such as Ohio, Michigan, Indiana, and Illinois, attracted European immigrants who moved further west, and Cleveland, Detroit, and Chicago were all cities that grew in size. The dispirited New England farmers abandoned the Rocky Holdings and went elsewhere. With the Erie Canal, it was easy to go west and take up farming south of the Great Lakes. This led to a transformation in the Northeast, calling it the Canal Consequences, and showed how long-established local market structures could be changed by emerging behemoths of the continental economy. American goods also affected an international market as Europeans began to feel the effects of American exports. The railroads were also developed during this time period. They were fast, reliable, and cheaper than canals to construct, and they were not frozen over in the winter. They were able to go anywhere. It defied terrain and weather. The first railroad appeared in 1828, and new lines spread swiftly. They faced strong opposition from canal builders, of course, because it was competition. Other obstacles that they faced: the brakes were feeble, and the engineers felt they might miss the station. Arrivals and departures were conjectural, and the differences in the gauge required passengers to make frequent changes of trains. Gauge is actually the width of and the thickness of the rails and how far apart they were, and it differed based on what railroad there was. So often one train could not continue on to another company or railroad company's track. Improvements came as gauges gradually became standard, which alleviated the problem that I just talked about. Safety devices were adopted, and Pullman sleeping cars were introduced in 1859. America at long last was bound together with braces of iron, later to be made of steel. This is a map showing the railroad revolution, showing all the new railroad construction in the 1850s and the heavy concentration in the North. This is a poster for the Baltimore and Susquehanna Railroad in 1840. Basically, it's advertising the train schedule, but also people most often had to coordinate legs on other railroad lines, stagecoaches, or canal boats to be able to get where they're going. Other forms of transportation and communication linked the United States and world. Cyrus Field in 1858 was called the greatest wire puller in history when he stretched a cable from Newfoundland to Ireland, the first transatlantic cable. A heavier cable in 1866 permanently linked the American and European continents. Donald Mackay developed new clipper ships. They sacrificed cargo space for speed, and their hour of glory was relatively brief. This is basically a picture of a boat that you might take a trip on as part of your leg of your trip. On the eve of the Civil War, British steamers won the race for maritime ascendancy. They were steadier, roomier, and more reliable, thus making them more profitable. Stagecoaches were immortalized by Mark Twain's Roughing It. Their dusty tracks stretched from the banks of the muddy Missouri River clear to California. The Pony Express was also recreated in 1860, and it carried mail speedily the 2,000 miles from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, which was a 10-day trip. Really, this lasted only 18 months. These were the main routes west before the Civil War. Express riders were unhorsed by Morse's clacking keys. So basically, the Pony Express was made very insignificant by Samuel Morse and the Telegraph. He began his messages to California in 1861. Swift ships and fleet ponies ushered out a dying technology of wind and muscle. In the future, machines will dominate the communication world. So the transportation revolution was stimulated by a desire of the East to tap the West. Western rivers drained southward to the Cotton Belt. Steamboats reversed the flow by bringing finished goods to the West and helped bind the West and South together. 3 decades before the Civil War, canals and railroads from the East tied seaboard with the blossoming heartland. And an impressive grid of internal improvements was established during this time period. By 1860, a truly continental economy had emerged.